And this is what we need, this kind of information out there to the body of Christ, because these are objections, these are challenges that are put forth by numerous anti-biblical creationists. So this is perfect.
One, I'm glad that some of them are here.
yeah, there we go. We got a whole list of them from Howard F., many of which we've discussed in the past. You just addressed the vast numbers of paleosols. That's a very interesting topic. I want to look more into that one. Coral reefs. Yes, I've heard that one many times.
Yeah.
Too many coral reefs to be accounted for in a global flood, young earth creation model. Any thoughts on that, Mike?
Well, coral reefs, they're claimed in the sedimentary rocks as well as today. I just got through looking at Pettijohn's book on sedimentary rocks and on carbonates. He came across it. He said that practically all these so-called reefs are generally carbonate banks. And a lot of times they're not really coral organisms or other types of organisms, algae, sponges, stuff like this. And, so the whole idea of buried reefs is questionable. And coral reefs today are not very deep and can form rapidly, we believe. There's a chapter in the book, Rock Solid Answers, that has an article on coral reefs that the reader can check. But I admit we still need more data on coral reefs. On limestones, we need more information on that too. Yeah, there is a vast number of paleosols, but it's only been around about 40 years. It's kind of a fad that suddenly popped up in geology, and there's a lot of them around in Montana and Wyoming and South Dakota, and I've seen these, and boy, I would question whether this is a true fossil soil, especially when they're missing the A horizon. It's just a B horizon. So why isn't it just a carbonate layer or a clay layer formed regularly by deposition in the flood? Excuse me. And he says there's a vast number of ancient river valleys. Are these in the strata? The strata generally don't show valleys, but we have a lot of valleys today and canyons on the surface of the earth, and these can form rapidly. When the floodwaters were running off, eroding so much sediments and sedimentary rocks, it first run off as wide currents, maybe 500 miles wide. And then as more mountains and plateaus extend up above the floodwaters are forced to channelize. And when they channelize, they got to accelerate because the same amount of water is now, instead of going over wide areas, now going over more narrow areas. So it's going to form valleys and canyons on the surface of the earth rapidly. So we have no problem with river valleys. As far as any ancient river valleys in the sediments, these are far and few between. There are some claims. Now, there's some claims in the Grand Canyon. You hardly ever see them, but what I've seen on these are just generally they're parabolic cuts in the top of a layer. They don't seem to be V-shaped valleys. And the flood can cause a scoop up part of the top of a sedimentary layer just laid down by eddies and faster flow in one part of a wide current than another. So we can form these features rapidly. And the lack of isostatic response of the removal of all the sediments. Well, yeah, I'm sure there's isostatic, but you had non-isostatic tectonics going on too. So, and that's why the mountains on the continents, which many of them have marine fossils at the very top, like Mount Everest in limestone. All this tectonics is why we find them uplifted mountains from out of the floodwaters. So isostasy would be all part of this, as well as as tectonics, maybe from heating of certain areas in the crust and mantle cause the uplift. Olier and Payne in their book, The Origin of Mountains, had 21 mechanisms for the origin of mountains, but they said they can't prove a single one of them. But there's a lot of ways to cause vertical changes in the crust and for mountains, and then even deep valleys by sinking. So we can explain many of these. We have reasonable answers within the broader flood model. Okay, removal of all the sediments and more. Okay, well, the removal of the sediments during recession would be by fast currents moving offshore and depositing, forming the continental shelf. So that was a lot of questions, and I have some reasonable answers to some of them. But of course, we're doing research on many of these things for better answers.
You know, we had a comment come in earlier, Mike, saying it was a positive comment. They were saying how much they appreciate how relaxed you are, and so you address these challenges, in many ways technical challenges, in a very relaxed, calm, collected, and informative manner. And I love that about you, brother.
Oh, thank you.
So let's give this one a plug. You mentioned it. Rock Solid Answers
yes.
is a rock solid book.
Reasonable answers to 14 geological questions by different creation scientists. I think John Whitmore did the one on reefs.
Yeah, I'm looking at it right now. Chapter 5 and chapter 6.
Two chapters.
Do soils indicate long ages? But chapter 6 is, do paleosols indicate long ages? So we were talking
Kleberg and Bandy. Yeah.
Chapter 9 is ancient reefs, modern and ancient reefs.
Yeah.
So we've got some good answers there.
Yeah.
And what if somebody were to point to the chalk layers and ask how much biomass so old Earth Cretaceous will say there's just not enough biomass for a young Earth Cretaceous to account for the amount of chalk, the sheer volume of chalk layers, hundreds of meters thick.
Yeah, I've heard that one many times. And, I think we have a reasonable answer. First of all, when you examine the data, you find there's a challenge to uniformitarianism because a lot of it's too pure for being around for tens of millions of years. I mean, you should have a lot of other sediments mixed in there. So that is a major challenge. Like I said, when you look at something in detail, you find that it's a challenge to uniformitarianism also. It also has flint layers in it, like it's a form of chert or silicon dioxide that are in there. But it can be, I think it's about 300 meters thick in southern England, northeast France. The way I think about this is that these are from microorganisms called coccolithopores, and these are the calcium carbonate skeletons. By the way, I might add that chalk in other areas, like in western Kansas, is not coccoliths, but foraminifera. So chalk doesn't necessarily mean coccolithopores. And I believe during the flood, you had a lot of vertical currents, and you'd have a lot of mixing, and you have a lot of nutrients in the water. And in areas of, say, upwelling, you could bring nitrogen, phosphorus, even iron that they need, silica, up to the surface. And you can have these monstrous blooms, is what I'm saying. And they can quickly fall to the ocean bottom, and then mass flow can collect this from a large area, put it into a smaller area, like in England and Northwest Europe, collect it all and almost pure because it happened really rapidly. And that can happen because of all the vertical motion in the floodwaters. We have the same thing with diatomaceous earth. And in diatomaceous earth, it's similar, but they're diatoms that collect. And of course, we observe all this very slow today. But in like the diatomaceous earth, we have some big animals in it, like whales in diatomite in Peru, and in West Central California in the Monterey Formation. Also, the chalk in western Kansas has big mosasaurs in it, and I think other large creatures, indicating again that this wasn't a slow rain of microorganisms, maybe at the present rate today of maybe a centimeter every 1,000 years, because these big organisms, the skeleton would totally decay in a very short time before you can collect much, indicating that these fine-grained sediments were formed rapidly. And like I said, I think deposited over a large area and concentrated in the small areas. Just recently, satellite pictures showed that after that after that undersea eruption in Tonga that extended up into the atmosphere and stratosphere, that ash fell west of Tonga in an area of the ocean that was considered sterile because of its lack of nutrients. And this ash falling on the surface created a huge bloom of microorganisms really fast. So ash, and you had a lot of volcanic eruptions during the flood, and a lot of those eruptions would descend, start under the floodwaters and extend out into the atmosphere, spread. This would all cause huge blooms of organisms. And so just like from that eruption on Tonga, huge blooms of microorganisms during the flood can explain the fine skeletons of plankton that we find as chalk and diatomaceous earth. And the fact that we have large creatures in them indicates that it wasn't a fine rain over thousands, tens of thousands, millions of years. So we have good answers for that, for those challenges.
And that's a great answer. That's what I call, Mike, a clip-worthy moment, as we do like to make shorter clips of our longer videos answering these challenges. And that way, when people have questions, we have good videos that we can send them.
Good.